I'm joined by Mike Brown, Energy Systems Design Engineer and host of the 3P Theory podcast. Thank you so much for joining me, Mike.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
That's awesome. And where are you taking this call from?
I'm actually in Dallas right now, Dallas, Texas.
Nice.
So it's a little bit colder than I would expect, but we're supposed to be in the 20s, and that's Fahrenheit.
Wow.
Later this week. So
is that normal?
Not really. I mean, it's kind of sporadic in January and February, but
yeah,
I don't know. We're moving into March, so hopefully we should be done with most of that here pretty soon.
Oh man, I did not realize it gets that cold in Texas.
Yeah,
that is cold. Wow. Well, I'm based in London, and we 20 degrees Fahrenheit is that's very rare. That doesn't happen here very often. So I'm surprised. But one thing, as I was reading about the work that you do as an energy engineer, I just came across this interesting statistic that 54% of all people on Earth live in cities. So more than half. And then the UN is projecting that by 2050, it'll be 66%. So that's like a big sizable chunk. And cities, at least the way I picture them, it's basically just a bunch of buildings everywhere. And so that's a big part of what you do really as an energy engineer, I understand, right? You focus on buildings. Is that kind of correct?
Correct, yeah. And they may not necessarily all be in urban spaces per se, but obviously a lot of the new developments that are coming online or even retrofits of existing buildings do happen predominantly in urban areas, or even just growing cities that are going to become more urbanized. So
that's cool. So what exactly is an energy engineer? I mean, it sounds kind of like something that a superhero might do. Like you engineer energy. Like, how cool is that?
Yeah. So I guess just for clarification, so I'm not necessarily doing design per se. However, in the context of, I guess, as you would say, maybe a high level or general terms of being an energy engineer is quite frankly someone that focuses on, I guess, the energy aspects. It could be buildings, it could be, other aspects within other industries that are related to energy. But specifically for me, it is buildings. And really, a lot of what we do is energy analysis and or water analysis for buildings to evaluate how much they're going to consume prior to them actually being built, and finding ways to optimize through collaboration on the architecture side, the contracting side, and even with the MEP engineers and mechanical, electrical, lighting, and plumbing side of things as well, for different systems alternatives and how we can really elevate the design of that particular building, not only from an aesthetic standpoint, but also from a functional performance standpoint.
How can you predict how much energy and water is going to, I mean, isn't that kind of based on like the people inside?
Yes. So, people do have the same question and they kind of wonder, it's like, do you have like this, magic globe or something that you can just like predict? I wish it were that easy, to be honest. However, there are various standards that are in place. And here in the United States, we have ASHRAE, and even IECC for International Energy. I'm sorry, International Energy Conservation Code, to set standards for what assumptions can be made for buildings, whether it be through occupancy, through schedules. And we always use that as a starting point, or a baseline, if you will. And then as the design progresses, we start to infuse that information. But again, as you kind of alluded to it, building occupancy and fluctuations in occupancy, even knowing the building type, if it's just going to be office or just going to be, hotel, varies quite widely compared to what assumptions are, which that's probably one of the greatest variabilities within energy modeling, is scheduling and occupancy. I know go ahead.
I was just thinking that, so that would be like if like you would assume that a building is maybe 80% full, but it's actually only 50% full, or it's at capacity. And so you kind of have to like, is it like you have to sort of take a range saying, I think that it's going to be using this much energy based on some sort of level of I guess like plus minus certain amount of percentage or something?
So from an occupancy standpoint, so we know what the peak amount, and this is defined by the building code, what the peak amount of individuals are going to be in the building, whether that's
Right.
visitors, full-time occupants. And from there, we usually create profiles that are typical, and ASHRAE defines, along with other standards, define what that is. And so
Hmm.
you're taking basically a percentage of the peak for every hour of the day. So think about maybe a typical, multifamily project. You have a much higher peak occupancy in the morning when people are there getting ready for work, getting
Yep.
ready to leave. Then it's going to taper off during the midday, and then until they come back home from work, then it's going to go
Hmm.
back up again. And so similarly, the HVAC, lighting, and even service hot water heating kind of follow that similar profile.
Yeah.
And then they're just percentages of that peak. Um, so for instance, if you say that, for a lighting power density or a lighting design for an interior space has a maximum power, if we turned on all the lights of this number, at that particular hour, we're assuming a certain percentage of that peak power.
Got it. I see.
So,
Wow, that's pretty cool. I mean, it sounds very
yeah.
mathematical. Calculations and things. That's cool. So I guess part of what you're doing is because I read this term, high performance buildings.
Mhm.
So does that takes into account basically how this energy is being used, or what exactly is a high performance building?
Sure. Um, so I'm glad you used the word high performance building as opposed to green building.
Okay.
Some would say those are synonymous, and to some degree they are. But high performance building really encompasses a lot more than just energy and water efficiency.
Hmm.
I know a little bit later we're going to talk about biophilia and things of that
Yeah. Yeah.
nature that relate to the occupant comfort and things of that nature. But it includes things like daylighting and how the quality of daylighting and access to daylighting you have in the space, along with things like air quality, so on and so forth. But really, and there's a definition here that I've kind of developed, just kind of a compilation of things, is really being able to optimize and have integration for all of the systems in the building so that it performs at a high level of comfort, but also at a low environmental impact.
Mm,
And so you basically have to look at the macro and the micro when you're trying to evaluate a building and the systems that are involved with that. Um, and so really, ultimately, if you do that correctly, you'll be able to achieve some operational savings and then maximize on those tenants or those occupants that are going to be in that space in terms of how well they have that occupant experience.
yeah. So what's the why don't you like the term green buildings, or why were you glad I said high performance?
I think in some ways there's some negative connotation, or there's some siloing of certain aspects of the building, like I mentioned before. So only focusing on energy and things of that nature, and until the more recent or in more recent years has been kind of the focus. Until now, there's been a shift to look at more of those. I don't want to say soft aspects of
Hmm.
building design, but they do have a quantifiable impact on the occupants, the building itself, and that can be rolled into even the building valuation when you're looking at it from a real estate standpoint, and how much they could potentially resell that building for by those aspects, and then even from a tenant retention standpoint as well. If we're talking about an office building
Yeah,
or a retail building that has tenants, and having those stakeholders be in that space long term because of some of those benefits.
I gotcha. So green buildings basically typically just focus on one or two things, like how well it, I guess, retains heat or cool inside the building. So meaning like you're going to have to use less electricity to heat and cool the building, whereas a high performance building would take into account basically everything inside, including how comfortable people are and how happy they are to be inside the building. Basically, it's almost like geometrical growth in all areas. It's performing at peak rather than just like being electrical, really good at using electricity.
Yeah, yeah, and I would say to use those same words in the same definition are okay, but I just think the perception of green building
I see.
is what you mentioned earlier. So, and so that's why high performance has become one of more of the terms that are used in the industry, just to kind of have a holistic standpoint of the facility.
That's really cool. So what is because I know that you're LEED certified.
A LEED accredited, yes.
LEED accredited,
Yeah.
sorry.
That's
So
okay.
LEED accredited, and I've seen this before, and I know that there's different tiers of accreditation, because that's basically LEED is essentially how sustainable, environmentally sustainable a building is. Like that's like the most basic definition,
Yeah, you can say
basically.
that. Yeah.
So I mean, what actually is LEED? Because I mean, that's about the in-depth of my knowledge of it. So how because I've seen some LEED buildings that are like platinum certified, and I think that's the highest you can go. So what exactly is LEED?
So LEED is Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design.
Right.
And so this was a certification rating system that was developed by USGBC, GBCI, around different aspects that would qualify a building as high performing or sustainable or green in a way that it can be more or less quantifiable. And there's different sections. So there's one on transportation and linkages, sustainable sites, water efficiency, energy efficiency, indoor environmental quality, materials and resources, and then there's also an innovations section as well. So for teams that are doing things that are above and beyond, they can actually be rewarded for that.
That's cool.
Yeah, and so within that rating system, like most rating systems, there's points for each of those, and if you're able to claim those points, they all add up to the different levels, whether it's certified, silver, gold, or platinum for LEED.
That's cool. So and then the points, who awards those points? I mean, how do the so I'm guessing there's someone that comes by from the LEED council or something and takes a look at.
So yeah, it is a third-party verified rating system.
Yeah.
And I think that's why the adoption, at least in recent years, has been so well and has grown so much, just because you do have a third party that is reviewing your design to make sure that those attributes are included. But at a very high level, what happens is the design team for that particular project, this is inclusive of architecture, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, landscape, civil, even structural in some cases, to make sure that the calculations and documentation is there, claiming those credits. And then all that information is sent off to GBCI for review. And once that review comes back, there may be comments that you have to address, and then you might have to do a resubmission, or, which I haven't seen it yet, you get all your points the first time around, and you don't have to do any resubmittals. But usually there's different interpretations. Yeah, I know. Yeah, because what's been really great about LEED in recent years is that it's moved away from just being exclusive to office buildings and facilities, and that's originally where it started, to encompass other building types like hospitality and hotels, multifamily, retail, even data centers and warehouses, things of that nature, that would more or less tweak some of the credits that are more in alignment with that particular building type. So for instance, one of the ones that I come across pretty frequently is on healthcare projects, for projects that are pursuing the daylighting credit before they made the LEED for healthcare, along with some of the addendums or changes in the language. For daylighting, it included all of the core spaces as well, in terms of counting against you because you didn't have access to daylight. However, in the new version, they only account for the perimeter rooms or spaces, which makes sense, right? Because typically by nature,
what would be an example of that? I think we're about to get into that.
Yeah, typically by nature, hospitals have a pretty deep floor plate.
What's a
unless
floor
it's
plate?
just the floor area of just the floor.
Okay.
For each of the levels. So whether it's a 10-story bed tower, or maybe if it's a 2-story healthcare facility, those floor plates or the depth from one side of the building to the other side of the building are pretty drastic, and so you can only get so much daylight into the space, even if you were to have floor to ceiling glass kind of thing.
Yeah, it can only go so far. Yeah.
Yeah,
Makes sense.
and so by nature, the rating system identified that as a means to say, hey, well, these projects aren't able to achieve this in any scenario just based on typical programming for a healthcare facility
Hmm.
and the way operations work and the way the design is. And so they tweaked that particular credit to allow for just focusing on the perimeter areas where it makes sense that you would have windows anyway to see if you're able to achieve the daylight quality that's needed.
Got it. So what you're saying, I get it, because before I was like, the daylight needed to get into the center of the building or the floor plate, and in some buildings that's just not possible, and so
Right.
they're being adjusted so it's actually it makes sense for like a hospital versus an office building where you'd want daylight
Right.
everywhere. That's really cool. And so what does it mean that you're LEED accredited then?
So with that, and so for me in particular, it's for new construction or NC BD plus C, which is for building design and construction.
Hmm.
And that just means that when I took the certification exam, it's particularly focused on that rating system for my particular knowledge base. That's not saying that I'm not aware of the requirements and some of the language around other rating systems within LEED, whether that be for commercial interiors or, like I mentioned before, for healthcare, hospitality, so on and so forth. It's really, the people that have those designations for those um, um, different rating systems just shows you that they're more privy and are super experts in that area. um, and up until recently, and they still have this in the newer version, is for the people that have the accreditation, you can actually claim a point on your um, in your submission for the rating system if you have a lead professional on the project.
Oh,
um,
cool.
So, for instance, if you didn't have one, that would be one less point that you could achieve for the rating system.
So maybe in some projects that could get you from like silver to gold, just that extra point, or is it
Uh,
or is it not that?
it could, but we try not to be that close
Okay.
on the line. We always like to have a couple of buffer points just because you're not sure what's going to happen in the review process, where you may lose, two or even three in some cases, to just have that buffer, just to
Got
be on the
it.
safe side.
Makes sense. So with your LEED accreditation, basically what you're able to do is to design the way that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but design the way that energy is used within a building that would fall within LEED standards.
um, I, I would say from a design standpoint, we aren't necessarily designing, but we are facilitators of the
Hmm.
design. Um, and so where we see a misalignment that is not necessarily meeting the requirement based on the language of that particular credit that they're trying to pursue, then that's when we step up and say, well, hey, we need to redesign this, or maybe we decide not to go for that credit and go for something that's more cost effective or economical for the project.
Hmm.
Because for projects that are really trying to achieve higher levels of certification, which is typically gold and beyond, I would say for the majority, at least of the areas that have more recent energy codes here locally, are probably going to automatically hit certified, if not silver in some cases,
Okay.
just based on an energy code and somewhat based on location as well.
Hmm.
So, if you were to, pick up one of these buildings here downtown and drop it somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, then it would be a challenge for it to get the certification there, because a lot of the location and transportation and sustainable sites credits are hinged on the location
Oh, I see.
of the facility. So what that does is it promotes, developers, owners, and builders to design in areas that promote walkability, that promote connection to other diverse uses and services, so that it minimizes the need um, for cars and things of that nature, so you can use alternative transportation, essentially.
Well, that's cool. That's interesting that they actually factor in how you get to the building
Hmm.
into the accreditation. Or into the certification. I didn't really
Yeah.
consider that part at all. But I mean, it does make sense because if you're looking at it from an environmental standpoint, you'd want to be able to get to the building without needing to drive or have any sort of environmental impact really too.
Right.
Yeah, that's cool.
Another one I'll bring up, which you may have heard of, and there was a lot of skepticism around it prior to them making the change with the more recent version of LEED, is with the bike rack credit. If you've heard of that before.
No, I haven't.
So there is a credit, and before it was in the sustainable sites section, where basically you could get a point for just putting bike racks out in front of the building based on the number of occupants or percentage of occupants you have for the building.
I see.
And so the problem with that is, if you have, say, maybe even if it's a manufacturing facility, which for one, more than likely those people aren't going to be biking to work.
Yeah.
But manufacturing facilities by nature are probably not going to be in the city center. They're going to maybe in the warehouse district or somewhere else where people have to drive. And then also with that, in the newer version, what they've done, so people can't just it was basically a freebie before.
Yeah.
But now people can't do that, because not only do you have to have the quantity of bike racks out front, but you also have to have, which this was in the old version, showers as well. So from people, when they travel to the site, they're sweaty, they have an opportunity at least to try and take a shower or wash themselves up. What they added in the new version is, in addition to those two things, you also have to be located near a bicycle network.
Okay.
So it basically has to have a bike path or a network near your building for you to even claim that. So in rural America, highly unlikely that you'll have a bike network out there like that.
Yeah.
So it made it much more challenging for those people to get that credit, which for the intent, it makes sense.
Yeah.
So
that's a clever way of doing it, to be connected to a bike network. I'm not sure if I would have thought of that. Like that's such a straightforward and obvious, like you have to be next to a place where it's easy to bike in order to be able to claim a bike credit, because it's not really fair. Like, I'm just going to put some bike racks in the back where no one can see them, they're out of the way, and just get a point for that and be on my way. You mentioned earlier the term HVAC, and I know we kind of touched on this before when we were talking earlier, but what is HVAC? Because I've seen it, that term before, and I've never really understood what it means, but it seems like it's an important part of what you do.
Yeah, I would say so. So with HVAC, that's essentially heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. So it focuses primarily on the mechanical systems of the building. So how are you getting in ventilation to the space? Also, how are you heating and cooling the space? Whether that's through electric heat, natural gas, fossil fuels, things of that nature, and the types of strategies for the different system types that are used in the building. So typically for certain buildings, and in a lot of the ASHRAE standards and IACC standards, they have definitions of what typical HVAC systems are used based on the building square footage and also based on the number of floors. And so you can always use that as a starting point. But then on top of that, there's an efficiency threshold that needs to be met for any of those system types. And so when we talk about ways to optimize or enhance the building performance, that is a means of doing that by either choosing a more efficient system type and or efficiency for that system. Because even if you were to look, say, at maybe chillers, whether it be water cooled or air cooled, there's a range of efficiencies, and typically that's based on the tonnage or cooling capacity that's required for the building. So it's really important very early on to just understand not only what's applicable for that particular building, but also from a programming standpoint, what makes sense, because oftentimes when those systems are being compared, and this really goes the same for a lot of energy conservation measures, is that when you're trying to compare apples to apples for one system over another or one strategy over another, people tend to always look at it from a one-sided standpoint. So I'll give you an example of that. So even in a scenario where you're looking at comparing two HVAC system types, obviously one of the opportunities would be you'd be able to save operationally on energy cost, right?
Yep.
Another thing, which again, that's why it's so important to look at the synergies amongst different strategies, is looking at what the peak cooling capacity could be for the facility as well. That's going to dictate the sizing of that system, how much HVAC closet space it's going to take up compared
Hmm.
to the other system, uh, especially for smaller buildings or buildings um, that may have other buildings overlooking them. Is understanding, okay, well, what do we want our roof to look like? Are we trying to do a terrace up there, or is it okay to put mechanical equipment up there and for it to be kind of not cluttered, but taking up that roof space?
Yeah.
Sometimes that's okay, sometimes it's not. So evaluating that, and then also looking at, from a maintenance standpoint, the maintenance costs associated
Hmm.
with that particular system versus the other. Um, and I'm not going to get into like the occupant comfort, but that's a whole another realm or piece that you can look at too when you're evaluating that, especially when you're looking at different glazing system types for the envelope or even insulation for that matter, because that drives all of those numbers.
Wow. And so, I mean, the more, so I guess a big part of what's really interesting about building efficiency, I think, and this is occurring to me as you're speaking, is that the more efficient the building is, which is good for the environment, but it ends up actually saving money as well, because the less you need to heat and cool the building, like you're mentioning the glazing and the insulation,
Hmm.
the more effective that those are, the less you need to turn on the heating and air conditioning. So it's like, yeah, you end up spending less money and you use less energy.
Exactly. So you have some first cost savings and then operational savings as well. So.
Wow, cool. That's
Mhm.
yeah, that's one thing I really love about sustainability, and everything I'm learning about it is the fact that the more, um, what I'm seeing as a trend is like the more sustainable you are from an environmental standpoint, the more you actually end up
Mhm.
being financially sustainable as well. It's like
Oh yeah.
oftentimes they really go hand in hand, and it's like pretty direct too. I mean, it's like we're saying here, you use less energy, good for the environment, good for the bottom line because you end up spending less.
Right. Right.
It makes it a really
The,
obvious choice. Yeah.
the one thing I would point out about that is that oftentimes in certain regions, um, and I'm speaking more specifically to the United States,
Hmm.
where say maybe energy is cheap or water is cheap,
Yeah.
makes it a little bit harder to make that sale. However, all that means is you have to craft or tailor the message a different way. Um, so as opposed to maybe focusing on the operational side, maybe you could focus on the front end cost savings if that's a concern for that particular developer to try and build for the least cost kind of thing.
Yeah.
But then also when you look at it from an occupant standpoint, who's going to be occupying that space, there's a value added to them, and so how you tailor the conversation of how do we extract that value is going to be critical for
Hmm.
whoever that building owner or manager is.
Yeah, that's a good point. So on that, about the well-being and the health of the occupants, because that's, I mean, buildings really do, at least from my understanding, they can really impact human health, right? And so that's a really big part of the consideration. Uh, what are some of the things that, like, how can buildings impact human health?
So you kind of alluded to it. So we do spend a huge amount of time, or a huge amount of our time in buildings.
Yeah,
Um, Based on the statistics, it's about 90% of our time that we spend um, in our lifetime indoors,
that's
whether that's
crazy.
at work or at home. I don't know, retail store, so on and so forth.
Do cars
So
count?
indoors. Uh, I, I think so. I may have to go back and look at that now.
Yeah, I'm
I had a
wondering.
feeling that you would say that, but you're right because that's a significant portion of people are commuting long, hour, 2 hour
Yeah,
drive. That's yeah, that adds up.
it's a twelfth of your day
Um,
potentially. 2 hours in
yeah,
a car. Yeah,
yeah, no, for sure.
that's a lot. So
Um,
sorry, cut you off there. 90%
y-
indoors.
yeah, so 90% indoors, and you know, I can send the graphic to you after the call, but um, if we look at all the things that impact our health, typically people always focus on, exercising, they focus on maybe even genetics and things of that nature. But the largest portion that really impacts your health is your environment. So that's indoor, outdoor environment. It's over 50%. So, if you did all you could do from an exercise standpoint, yeah, good genetics, the largest percentage of the pie that impacts your overall well-being and your probability for well-being is your environment.
Mm.
And so, with that ideology, the intent is that from a design standpoint, whether it's from a renovation or even for a new construction project, that we focus on the elements like biophilia, like air quality, like water quality, or even access to clean water,
Mm-hmm.
even in a developed country. Um, for the interior of the space is to really maximize so that you can bring out the greatest productivity of those individuals in that space, and so they feel better as well. I think a lot of people kind of discount the long-term effects of poor air quality
Mm-hmm.
inside buildings. You know how ventilation in ASHRAE 62.1 and things of that nature came about is sick building syndrome. So there wasn't enough fresh air being brought into the building, and so people were getting sick. And so that's why they started introducing standards for minimum levels of outside air to be able to dilute the space of all of the chemicals, and things of that nature, CO2 in the space as well, by others, just breathing.
Yeah.
Um, and and so with that, just being able to be mindful from a design standpoint of how can we maximize all those different areas. Even lighting, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
is another category that people often discount. Um, you know, Granted, from an aesthetic point, there's various ways you can design to have great lighting, um, different color rendering indexes and things of that nature. Um, but one of the things that's starting to emerge now is circadian lighting design, which is essentially kind of mimics the circadian rhythm of our natural flow or state as we perceive light, and then also as our body responds to that. So naturally, as the sun goes up, sun goes down. Um, in a normal state without artificial light, your body decreases or increases melatonin so that
Right.
you know what time it is to go to sleep, what time it is to wake up, so on and so forth, which also impacts other biological functions as well. But
Mm-hmm.
being able to design lighting indoors that somewhat mimics that, so that people are healthier and more productive as well.
That's crazy.
Um,
How do you imitate that, or how do you get close to even mimicking that?
So yeah, so technology now, especially with the emergence of LED lighting, has allowed lighting manufacturers to create fixtures that are more or less tunable to be able to go from that warmer color
Mm-hmm.
to the colder color, to be able to have that variation in the light. And so oftentimes this is really really beneficial to people who are night shift workers
Yeah.
that are the exact opposite of what they need to be consuming from a natural daylight standpoint. And so that's why you hear about, those individuals having poor sleep quality and things of that nature. Not to mention, just normal working quality and productivity being decreased as well. But also that coupled with air quality increases your chance for heart disease as well, and other
Wow.
ailments. So again, this a lot of these things, and I think that's why it's been people have been paying more attention to it now, is because there's been a lot more studies that have been done to validate some of this,
Mm-hmm.
because it's something that happens over time. It's not necessarily something that, oh, okay, if I'm in this poor space now, I'm going to feel it before the end of the week. In some cases, that if it's extreme, that could be the case, but it's kind of the chronic development of those or of being in those poor quality spaces that starts to develop those risk factors, if you will.
Yeah. And it's amazing too, because it's like, for someone like me, where, you can obviously tell I'm not an expert, even remotely close to anything related to buildings. I would never be able to tell by walking into a space whether or not it's good for my health. I
Yep.
mean, I can walk in, and if it smells really damp and it's like, oh, wow, but like that has to be a really bad, but like if,
Right.
going into an office building, I'm just thinking like, you know, I kind of have a headache here, but maybe it's just not enough coffee, and that's just the way it is because it's a Wednesday kind of a thing, or a Tuesday, and but it's like the long term effects, like you're saying. I would never actually think, well, maybe it's because not enough airflow quality in here, and not enough proper lighting, or the lighting is too intense and,
Mhm.
all of these things. And it's like you really need an expert, someone who really understands to be able to discern whether or not a space is healthy or not.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and with the well building standard, which is just an option that people can pursue, that kind of lays out the intent of those particular strategies and
Yeah.
kind of puts some quantifiable metrics to it, can really help designers build or develop a space that encompasses a way to optimize that. And
Hmm.
there's various strategies that you can do to achieve the intent or the goal
Yeah.
of the feature or the credit. And I think a lot of times people, like I mentioned before, they just discount it because it's something that is hard to quantify in practice, even after the space is built out,
Hmm.
from a long-term standpoint. Now, typically for projects that are pursuing that particular certification, they have people that come in, they do testing with meters and things of that nature to make sure that you're achieving those levels. But
Hmm.
again, if you don't have the policies in place, whether it be from a maintenance standpoint or purchasing policy standpoint to make sure that that's continued, then like any other building that's built to high performance standards that's not maintained, it's going
Yeah.
to degrade over time. Um, and so I think in the near future, that's going to be more and more important, that buildings have that capability, especially from just a monitoring standpoint. Like if you were able to see on the wall a display that showed the CO2 level, VOCs, particulate matter, um, chemicals, things of that nature that are in this space, you would be more mindful, and that would also put more accountability on the facilities manager or the owner of that building as well, right?
Yeah, totally.
So,
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, like, I think the only monitor that I've seen, I mean, going into like a store where you can buy, like a hardware store, is basically like a carbon monoxide
mhm.
alarm, where it's like if carbon monoxide gets to an outrageous number, then it'll go off. But otherwise, I have no idea what my air quality is like. And thankfully, I've never had the alarm go off. So, in my mind, I live in a healthy, the quality of space, the quality of air in the space I live in is healthy because carbon monoxide alarm has never gone off. But what you're saying is there's a bunch of other things, sounds like that, where it's
Yeah,
like,
that are
yeah,
of concern. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. If there's a little thing that's like, you're a bit above average, like that's not really good. I mean, the first thing we do is like go knocking on someone's door, and be like, "Excuse me, why is that number higher than it should be?"
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want that. Fix that. Well, that's really cool. So all of these things led you to starting your own podcast, and that's the 3P Theory podcast.
Yeah.
The first question actually I wanted to know, which is a little bit less about the podcast and more about the name. What is 3P?
So the 3P came about because with sustainability, for it to really work, you really need to be able to bridge the gaps and use the collective um, strategies on the profit side, the people side, and also the planet side or environmental side
Oh, that's
when
cool.
it comes to really anything, whether it's design related, whether it's manufacturing or fashion industry related,
Hmm.
is bringing all those together. Um, I would say equally, but I know that may not always be the case.
Yeah,
As a part of the stakeholders for developing that project or developing that initiative.
that's really
So
cool.
yeah, so 3P came out of
Yeah,
that.
that makes sense. I haven't heard actually of the Profit People Planet, but it makes a lot of sense. And it's something that I feel like I've been alluding to and trying to sort of describe that, you need profit is such an important part of
It
this whole
is.
thing. And yeah, I think there's a yeah, it's easy to think, well, we should be a little bit more idealistic, but ultimately, I mean, the way our culture is designed, like money is important and it's a
Yeah,
big consideration. So may as well work towards that. And that's kind of what we were talking about earlier about, um, just leading with the financial benefits of being environmentally sustainable.
right.
So
And one of the things people don't talk about as well, and this is kind of leaning on the environmental side, is what are the what is the owner or what is the facility's liability or risk that they're putting themselves in by doing what they're doing now, and how that'll impact them in the future.
mm,
So, for instance, on some projects, we even do future climate weather files to see how the building will perform 25 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, considering the projections of climate change and all the other factors. And so then we can kind of build some resiliency into the building for more long term, because ultimately buildings are meant to last for a long time, right?
Yeah.
And so being able to minimize the risk and more or less protect that investment for the owner. So even if they sell it off to someone else.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of, did you see when there was that massive hurricane in Florida, that one building that was hurricane proof? It was like category 4 or whatever it was, hurricane proof. And like, there's just a photo and everything
else is gone.
completely flattened. And the only thing that happened to this building is like one little part of it sort of like broke off, but otherwise it was perfect. That's, I mean, that's the kind of stuff I guess that you can help with.
Yeah, no, definitely. And awesome. Especially, I mean, in areas like that where insurance is already pretty significant. Yeah, so it's
keeping that in mind. So one question I love to ask, just kind of as an inspiration, is what do you do, like personally on a day-to-day basis, aside from all the work that you're doing, to be environmentally friendly, like when you're at home or at work?
One of the things I do pretty frequently is recycle.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because the apartment complex where I live, they don't necessarily do recycling. Because some multifamily projects have it built in to where they have separate recycling, and so I take it up on my part or my duty to be able to recycle paper, any kind of cans and things of that nature, and so that's kind of on a day-to-day. That's what I do pretty regularly when I can and when I remember. When I go to the grocery store, or really when I go to like the convenience store, if I go to get takeout food, I don't take a plastic bag. I just carry it in my hands.
Yeah.
When I can remember, because I mean, you'd be surprised. Sometimes you go to the convenience store and you get a candy bar and a soda, and they say, "Oh, do you want a bag?" And I'm like, "No, I don't need a bag just for those 2 items." So, so yeah, I mean, obviously being just doing my part, knowing that it's just a small drop in the bucket that over time, and then obviously with the collective, as we educate others to do the same, can have a big impact.
Absolutely. I think that's the important thing to remember, really, is that it's little actions done every day that add up, and if everyone's doing it, then it does really make a big difference in the end.
Definitely.
And one thing I'm learning and hearing about from many other people I've been talking to is that it's really important just to do what you can and not like get frustrated by like trying to be perfect. Because I think it's really easy to get paralyzed by perfection in this space.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And because when you start looking around, it's like you just get overwhelmed, and so you just do a little bit at a time. So it's good to hear. Recycling is great. And I'm conscious of time here, so where can people learn more about your work and listen to your podcast?
Yeah. So on Instagram, they can find me at mcharles Jr. I'm also on LinkedIn and on Twitter as well as mcharles Jr. So with 3P Theory, we also have our website at www.3ptheory.com, where you can see all the episodes, and there's other content from all of all of our guests.
It's awesome to speak with other podcasters who are speaking with professionals in the kind of sustainability and environmental space. So thank you very much for taking the time with me, Mike. It was lovely to speak with you, and really interesting to hear about what can be done with buildings to make them more high performance.
Awesome. I was glad to be here. Look forward to catching up with you soon.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, give us a 5-star rating. And also, please subscribe, whether on your podcast app or on YouTube. And that way you can be the first to know about new episodes. Thank you very much, and talk to you soon.